Sarah gripped her boarding pass tightly as she stepped onto the plane, doing her best to ignore the sideways glances and silent judgments around her. She didn't want attention. She didn't want to be noticed. All she wanted was to get home. But from the moment she entered the cabin, she felt it. Something was off. The flight attendant's gaze swept over her from head to toe, her smile stretched thin, a mask of professionalism barely hiding the silent scrutiny in her eyes. This wasn't warmth. This wasn't politeness. This was an unspoken assessment, a judgment passed without a single word. The passengers nearby noticed, but quickly averted their eyes, retreating into the safety of their own bubbles. The silence was thick, heavier than the recycled air pressing down in the cabin. What Sarah didn't know was that someone else on that flight was watching, taking in every moment. And that someone? One of Hollywood's most famous actors. But it was what he did next that would leave everyone speechless. Before we get into this incredible story, let us know where you're watching from. And if you love stories like this, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we have another powerful story you won't want to miss. Los Angeles International Airport was a chaotic symphony of rolling suitcases, overlapping voices, and muffled announcements crackling over the loudspeakers. But Sarah barely noticed any of it. Her focus was locked onto the glowing screen of her phone, her fingers scrolling frantically, searching for an update that still hadn't come. Unread message from the vet. Her chest tightened. Toby, her elderly beagle, was sick, very sick. The vet had promised to send the final test results before her flight, but so far, nothing. She took a shaky breath, trying to suppress the growing sense of dread creeping up her spine. She glanced around absently at the travelers bustling past her, but the feeling was there again, that sensation she had grown all too familiar with. The stares. Not the fleeting glances of curiosity or absent-minded observation. These were different. These came weighted with something else. Something heavier. Judgment. As if her mere presence disrupted the space she occupied. Sarah knew why. She always had. Her body had never fit into the narrow mold of what the world expected. She wasn't small. She wasn't delicate. She didn't shrink herself into neutral-colored clothes to disappear. She existed unapologetically, and that, it seemed, made people uncomfortable. Today, she wore a pink t-shirt with bold white letters that read, "Peace, Love, and Dogs." She adored the message, but she knew the irony wasn't lost on the people around her, people who looked at her and decided she didn't match the image they had in their minds. But she refused to let that stop her. Then, beep. Her phone vibrated. "The test results aren't good, Sarah. We need to talk as soon as possible." Her stomach twisted. A lump formed in her throat. Deep down, she had already known. From the moment Toby stopped eating, from the way he curled up instead of running to greet her at the door. She had felt it. But seeing those words in black and white made it real. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep it together. She still had hours of travel ahead. She couldn't break down here, not in the middle of a crowd of strangers, not when she was already being watched. And then, a voice. Calm. Casual. Right beside her. "That's a philosophy I live by too." Sarah looked up. A tall man stood there, dressed simply, his face unshaven, his tousled hair slightly disheveled. He wasn't looking at her, he was looking at her shirt. His smile wasn't mocking. It wasn't condescending. It was just genuine. For the first time all day, something in her chest loosened. "Seems like a good motto, right?" she said hesitantly, offering a small smile. He nodded, as if about to say more, but then Sarah's phone buzzed again. Her pulse spiked. Maybe it was the vet. Maybe it was another update on Toby. She quickly looked down at the screen. Just a flight reminder. When she looked up again, the stranger was gone, swallowed by the steady flow of passengers moving toward the boarding gate. She exhaled deeply, brushing off the strange, unsettled feeling the encounter left behind. But as she stepped forward in line, a sudden chill ran down her spine. A woman was staring at her. Not just looking, staring. She was one of the flight attendants. Slim. Perfectly groomed. Hair pulled back into a severe, unforgiving bun. Her uniform crisp, every line perfectly in place. But it wasn't her appearance that made Sarah's breath itch. It was her eyes. Cold. Calculating. A look that said everything without a single word. Disdain. Not the mild, indifferent kind, like Sarah had simply done something slightly irritating. No. This was sharper. More pointed. The kind that carried an unspoken message, you don't belong here. Sarah knew exactly why. Her heartbeat quickened, the familiar tightness creeping into her chest, the silent humiliation, the expectation that she should feel ashamed for taking up space. The flight attendant blinked, slow and deliberate, as if already predicting that Sarah was going to be a problem. But what neither of them knew was that someone else had seen everything, and he wasn't going to stay silent. What happened next? You won't believe it. Stick around, because this story is about to take a turn no one saw coming. Sarah tightened her grip on her bag strap as she made her way down the airplane aisle, feeling the weight of every stare that followed her. The discomfort was thick, clinging to the air like humidity before a storm. Some passengers tried to be subtle, flicking their eyes away the moment she passed. Others didn't even bother, scanning her from head to toe, their expressions barely concealing the unspoken question, how does someone like that end up here? She ignored it. It wasn't the first time. It wouldn't be the last. She just needed to find her seat. Get settled. Block out the noise. But then, a voice, syrupy sweet, too sweet, cut through the moment. Oh, sweetheart, is this really your seat? Sarah stopped mid-step. The voice belonged to the same flight attendant who had scrutinized her at the boarding gate. Sarah glanced at the boarding pass in her hand. She already knew the answer, but still, she double-checked. Yes. 22B, she was exactly where she was supposed to be. But the way the woman said it, like it was a mistake, like Sarah couldn't possibly belong there, made her stomach twist. She lifted her gaze, forcing herself to meet the flight attendant's eyes. The woman held a tablet, pretending to check something, but Sarah could see the truth in her expression. Her smile was thin, artificial. Her eyes? Glimmering with something Sarah recognized immediately. Satisfaction. She wanted to embarrass her. The silence stretched. The passengers nearby weren't looking, but Sarah felt them listening. Waiting. She kept her voice steady. Yes. 22B. The flight attendant's smile didn't waver. If anything, it deepened, just a fraction. If you need more space, she said, voice light, almost cheerful, I can try to find a more appropriate seat. She let the words hang, then added, as if it were an afterthought, of course, that comes at a cost. Sarah's face burned. This wasn't an offer of help. This was a veiled insult wrapped in faux kindness. She knew exactly what the woman meant. You don't fit. You don't belong here. Her chest tightened. She opened her mouth, ready to respond, but then she noticed movement beside her. A man making his way toward first class. The same man from earlier. The one who had complimented her t-shirt. He didn't stop. Didn't say a word. But for the briefest moment, his gaze flicked toward the flight attendant. Just a second. Barely noticeable. And then he kept walking. Sarah exhaled, slow and controlled. She wasn't going to let this woman get to her. I'm fine with my seat, thank you. And without waiting for a response, she stepped past the flight attendant and slid into her row. But just as she settled into 22B, something made her breath hitch. The passenger seated next to her looked at her, just for a second, then, without a word, gathered his things and moved. Sarah swallowed hard. She wasn't going to shrink. She wasn't going to let it get to her. But still, a cold, certain thought settled in her mind. This wasn't over. She focused on her breathing, keeping it steady, refusing to let the moment overwhelm her. The man in the aisle seat, glasses, graying hair, had stayed. He seemed torn, as if he wanted to say something but didn't know how. At least he hadn't moved away. A small victory. Trying to shake off the tension, Sarah reached for her carry-on. The overhead bin was tight, and her bag was heavy. She tried once. No luck. Adjusted the angle. Still stuck. Her face grew warm. She hated this feeling. Before she could try again, a shadow moved beside her. Need some help? She turned. It was the man in the aisle seat. His voice was casual, free of judgment. She exhaled, tension easing just a fraction. Yes, thank you. Together, they adjusted the bag, working it into place. And then, just as they were about to push it in, a voice. Sharp. Cutting. Let's just hope the compartment holds up. Silence. Instant. Heavy. Sarah froze. The flight attendant stood a few steps away, arms crossed, that same thin smirk playing at her lips. The way she said it, so effortlessly, so offhand, it could have almost passed as nothing. Almost. But Sarah knew. Everyone knew. The man beside her, still holding the bag, went completely still. His expression shifted, his jaw tightening. The humiliation was raw, slicing through Sarah's chest like a blade. She glanced around. No one said anything. But they had heard. Every single one of them had heard. The man beside her adjusted his glasses. Then, without looking at the flight attendant, he gave the bag one final push. Click. It locked into place. Then, in a voice noticeably firmer than before, he simply said, "There." Nothing more. But Sarah felt the weight behind it. She forced herself to lift her chin. "Thank you." She sat down. Shoulders squared. Muscles tense. But deep down, she knew this flight was far from over. And what happened next? No one could have predicted. Want to hear the rest of this unbelievable story? Stay tuned, because what happened after this moment changed everything. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow, we have another powerful story just for you. Sarah clenched her arms tightly around herself, refusing to let this break her. The flight attendant didn't say another word, just one last glance of quiet disdain before turning and walking away. The man beside her sighed, settling into his seat and pulling out a book. Sarah noticed he parted his lips, as if about to say something, but then hesitated and stopped. He didn't need to say anything, his actions had already said enough. But deep down, she knew. This wasn't over. She glanced down the aisle. The flight attendant was speaking to another crew member, her body language relaxed, casual. But then, mid-conversation, she flicked her gaze back to Sarah and smiled. A slow, small, dangerous smile. A chill ran down Sarah's spine. The plane was still boarding. Passengers weaved through the narrow aisle, luggage clunking into overhead compartments, voices blending into a steady hum. But beneath the noise, there was something else. A silence. Thick. Uncomfortable. Sarah felt it. Everyone felt it. The flight attendant no longer looked directly at her, but her presence lingered like a thorn under the skin. She moved through the cabin, flashing polite smiles at some passengers, offering soft words of reassurance. But Sarah saw it, those same eyes, sharp and scrutinizing, when she thought no one was paying attention. And then came the next blow. Sarah noticed when a well-dressed businessman hesitated upon reaching her row. He glanced at the seat number on his boarding pass, then at Sarah. There was a pause. A deep breath. And then, only then, he sat down beside her. It was small. Barely noticeable. But Sarah noticed. It wasn't exhaustion. It wasn't distraction. It was hesitation. She ignored it. Or at least, she tried. A short while later, the flight attendant reappeared, stopping beside their row with that same fake smile. "The gentleman next to you might want a bit more space," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness. "But let's see how the flight goes, shall we?" Silence. Sarah's stomach twisted. She knew exactly what the woman was implying. The businessman adjusted his tie, visibly uncomfortable. For a second, he looked like he might say something. His lips parted, a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. But then, nothing. He said nothing. The flight attendant waited, as if expecting him to accept her offer, as if already prepared to accommodate his unspoken discomfort. But when he didn't respond, she simply smiled again and walked away. But Sarah knew. She had planted the seed. The businessman no longer looked at her. She clenched her fists in her lap. And then, "This is wrong." Sarah blinked, surprised. The voice had come from her row. But not from the businessman. From the woman sitting in the aisle seat. She was young, maybe early 20s, her dark hair tied up in a messy bun. She looked hesitant, like she wasn't sure if she should have spoken at all. But her gaze was locked on the flight attendant as she walked away. Then, she turned to Sarah. "Someone needs to do something." Sarah swallowed hard. She wasn't alone in this. But if this woman thought the flight attendant had already crossed the line, she was wrong. Because the worst was yet to come. The flight was already in the air. The engines hummed steadily beneath them. For a moment, Sarah closed her eyes, willing herself to block out everything. But her mind wouldn't let her. The humiliation came in waves. The looks. The comments. The sheer discomfort radiating off the man beside her. It all swirled in her head, making it impossible to relax. She didn't want to care. She didn't want this to get to her. But it did. And deep down, she knew. It wasn't over yet. A short while later, as the crew prepared the in-flight service, Sarah caught the first sign that things were about to get worse. The flight attendant's tone had changed. From her seat, she could hear them speaking through their headsets. It was muffled, but she caught the occasional whisper. A quiet chuckle. Something was going on. And then, the final blow. The flight attendant stopped beside Sarah's row. A tray in her hands. Her smile was polite, but her eyes gleamed with something cruel. "Oh, sweetheart," she cooed, voice dripping with artificial kindness, "here's your special order." Sarah frowned. Special order? The flight attendant feigned an exaggerated look of surprise. "Yes. An extra meal, specially prepared just for you." Sarah felt the heat rush to her face. This was it. The most public humiliation yet. The businessman beside her turned away, visibly uncomfortable. The young woman in the aisle seat widened her eyes. Other passengers were watching now. Sarah knew exactly what this meant. This wasn't about food. This was about making her feel too big. Too out of place. Too wrong to be here. The shame hit hard. And before she could react, a new voice shattered the silence. That was completely unnecessary. The flight attendant stiffened. She turned, her expression faltering for the first time. The voice had come from the aisle seat. The young woman crossed her arms, her jaw tight. She didn't order an extra meal. The flight attendant's eyes darkened. "Excuse me?" Her voice was colder now. But before she could say another word, someone else spoke. A deep, steady voice. From first class. A voice everyone recognized. And when Sarah turned to see who had spoken, her heart stopped. Because it was him. The same man from earlier. The one who had complimented her t-shirt. The one who had noticed everything. And what he did next. No one saw it coming. Want to know how this incredible story ends? Stay tuned, because what happens next will leave you speechless. If you're new here, don't forget to subscribe, because tomorrow we have another powerful story just for you. Sarah felt a mix of emotions, humiliation, frustration, but now something new was creeping in. Relief. Someone was finally speaking up. But the flight attendant? She wasn't intimidated. She simply raised an eyebrow, her smug smile never faltering. "Well, if she doesn't want the extra meal, I can redistribute it," she said, taking a small step back, her tone feigning kindness. Then, with a voice dripping in condescension, she added, "Are you sure, sweetheart? You look like you need it." The air left Sarah's lungs. That was the hardest blow yet. The entire plane heard it this time. Even the passengers who had pretended not to notice before, who had kept their heads down, avoiding the tension, were now exchanging glances. The discomfort was no longer just Sarah's. It was collective. But all Sarah felt was a crushing wave of shame. She swallowed hard, the knot in her throat tightening. She refused to cry. Not here. Not in front of her. But then, something unexpected happened. A sharp chime rang through the cabin. The PA system. And then, a voice. Male. Calm. Firm. What exactly is the problem here? The flight attendant went pale. Sarah recognized the voice instantly. Slowly, she turned toward the aisle. And saw him. The man from earlier. The one who had complimented her t-shirt before the flight. But now, she saw who he really was. Keanu Reeves. The entire plane froze. Silence fell like a heavy curtain. Sarah felt a chill rush down her spine. And the flight attendant? She looked like she had just seen a ghost. The arrogant stance she had held moments ago, the untouchable confidence, was gone. She opened her mouth. Closed it. Blinked rapidly, as if trying to process what had just happened. Because standing in the aisle, looking straight at her, was Keanu Reeves. The passengers who had once been too busy to pay attention, they were watching now. Phones were discreetly lifted. Screens started recording. This wasn't just an uncomfortable moment anymore. This was something else. Keanu crossed his arms. His gaze never wavered. I asked, what exactly is the problem here? His voice wasn't loud. It wasn't aggressive. But it carried weight. A natural authority that made the entire plane hold its breath. The flight attendant tried, desperately, to regain her composure. She forced a smile, but it was nothing like before. It was strained. Uncertain. "Yes, sir, I'm just doing my job." Keanu tilted his head slightly, studying her. Then, his next words cut through the air like a blade. "And does your job include humiliating passengers?" Sarah felt the air around her shift. The flight attendant's face flushed red. The tension was suffocating. Sarah sat frozen in her seat. She had never imagined someone like Keanu Reeves stepping into this fight. But he had. And now, she wasn't alone anymore. Keanu turned, his expression softening just slightly as he looked directly at Sarah. His eyes weren't filled with pity. They were filled with respect. "Are you okay?" Sarah's chest felt tight. Everything inside her screamed, "Don't get emotional, not here, not now." She swallowed hard and nodded. "I'm fine." It wasn't entirely true. But in that moment, it was the best she could say. Keanu studied her for a moment, as if he knew there was more behind her words. But he didn't push. He just turned back to the flight attendant. And that was the moment the entire plane shifted. The whispers began. Passengers murmured to one another. Phones recorded from different angles. The businessman next to Sarah adjusted his glasses awkwardly. The young woman in the aisle seat watched with wide eyes. And the flight attendant? She saw the cameras. And realized, too late, that she had lost control. The fake smile vanished. She opened her mouth as if to salvage the situation, but Keanu cut her off. "Oh, so now you recognize me?" The entire plane reacted. A ripple of hushed gasps and chuckles spread through the cabin. The flight attendant's face burned even redder. Sarah felt pure adrenaline. Keanu had just exposed her, and the crew knew it. At the front of the cabin, another flight attendant, who had been silently watching until now, suddenly looked nervous. He muttered something into his headset. Sarah didn't know what was being said, but she knew that something big was about to happen. And then Keanu smirked. Not a cruel smirk, just a small, knowing smile. And then he said the words that changed everything. "I think there's been a mistake with the seating arrangement." He glanced at Sarah. "I believe my seat is next to hers." The entire plane froze. Sarah's breath caught. He wanted to switch seats. The flight attendant's jaw clenched. She swallowed hard. She was losing, and she knew it. "Sir, that's not necessary," she tried weakly. But Keanu? He stayed calm, unshaken. "Actually, I think it is." Silence. Then, the shift. A public statement. A power move. Passengers exchanged glances. The young woman in the aisle seat let out an audible breath of pure disbelief. And the flight attendant? She looked around, desperate, as if searching for a crew member who could save her. But no one did. Because at that moment, everyone knew exactly who was in control. And it wasn't her. Want to hear what happened next? Stick around, because what Keanu Reeves did after this moment left the entire plane speechless. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow we have another unbelievable story you won't want to miss. The cabin was silent. Every passenger was watching. Phones were raised, recording. The world was about to see everything. The flight attendant had nowhere to hide. Sarah felt a lump in her throat. She turned to Keanu, trying to understand. He didn't have to do this. Not at all. But he was. And deep down, she knew this wasn't just about a seat. It was about everything. About dignity. About respect. About not letting humiliation go unnoticed. The flight attendant scrambled to regain control. "Sir, first class has its rules and procedures." Keanu raised an eyebrow. His voice was calm, but razor sharp. "And do any of those procedures include discriminating against passengers?" The entire plane heard it. The flight attendant's mouth opened, then shut. She had no response. Keanu exhaled slowly, then, without another word, he stood up. He grabbed his backpack, slung it over one shoulder, and turned to Sarah with a small smile. "The seat is all yours." Sarah's chest tightened. She wanted to refuse. Wanted to say she didn't need it. But she did. Not just for the comfort, but for what it represented. She swallowed hard. "Thank you." Her voice came out quieter than she intended. Keanu just nodded. Sarah stood up. And for the first time on this trip, she felt in control. As she walked down the aisle, passengers smiled at her discreetly. Some nodded. Some whispered. She was no longer invisible. She was no longer being ignored. When she reached first class, the attendants there greeted her kindly. No looks of disdain. No venomous remarks. Just a polite nod. A warm smile. She settled into the spacious seat. The soft fabric against her skin was a stark contrast to everything she had felt until now. And then, she glanced forward. Keanu was settling into her old seat. Completely at ease. As if nothing had happened. He pulled out a book, flipping through the pages casually. But Sarah knew. Something had happened. And soon, the whole world would know, too. At the back of the plane, someone was already uploading the video. Keanu Reeves swapped seats with a passenger after she was humiliated on a flight. The caption spread like wildfire. Sarah had no idea what was coming. But in just a few hours, the entire world would know what had happened. Hours later, the plane landed. As passengers gathered their belongings, Sarah felt it before she even checked her phone. The shift. People looked at her differently now. Not with judgment, with curiosity. At the arrival gate, small groups of passengers huddled together, scrolling through their phones, laughing and animatedly discussing something. Sarah felt a shiver run down her spine. She pulled out her phone, unlocked the screen. And there it was. The video. Someone had captured everything. The flight attendant's cruel remarks. The exact moment Keanu stepped in. The moment he switched seats. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the comments. Millions of views. Thousands of shares. A global conversation unfolding in real time. She had never wanted attention. Had never wanted her pain to become a viral moment. But for the first time in her life, she felt seen. And then, the official response arrived. A notification popped up on her screen. Breaking news, official statement from the airline. She clicked on it. After an internal investigation into the incident involving discrimination against a passenger, we have confirmed the termination of the employee involved. We reaffirm our commitment to treating all customers with respect and dignity. Sarah's breath caught. The flight attendant had been fired. Her personal experience had become bigger than her. It had turned into a global discussion about respect, about empathy. And then, one more notification. Just one. From an unknown number. She opened it. Hope you're doing well. Keep spreading peace, love, and dogs around the world. Sarah's lips parted. She smiled. Keanu. She looked at the bustling airport ahead of her, exhaled deeply, and grabbed her suitcase. Then, she stepped forward. Because on that day, something changed. Not just in the world, but inside her. If this story moved you, we have more stories of kindness, resilience, and compassion waiting for you. Click on the screen to watch more inspiring moments that prove there's still good in this world.